And the government even allows the cigarette companies to sell their drugs using cartoons. Now, who you think they target in the cartoon for? Do y'all follow me? Anything you see on TV desensitizes you to the effects of it. That's how you control the people. It's called propaganda. And if you've never read a book on propaganda, go and get one. It is the deliberate controlling of people's minds through the images that you saw. CNN, C-SPAN, controlled by big corporate business. During the presidential race, Obama, I told people Obama would win soon when he got in the race. They said, well, why you say that? He's black. If you say so, but that ain't why he's going to win. He's going to win because he was chosen as an undergrad. Do you know who Obama's undergrad advisor was? A man by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Do you know who Zbigniew Brzezinski was? He's the man that the Rockefeller family paid in 1973 to create the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations.
This leads us to Zbigniew Brzezinski because he created the Mujahideen in the late 1970s, which were later renamed Al-Qaeda.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
In earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.
He has proven to be an outstanding friend and somebody who I've learned an immense amount from. And for him to support me in this campaign and then be willing to come out here to Iowa is a testimony to his generosity. So if everybody could please give Dr. Brzezinski another round of applause.
You got to study this stuff, black people. Study it. You ain't going to get nothing new from him. It's the same old thing. Next slide. Tobacco and liquor are drugs. Cigarettes and alcohol kill more blacks every year than cocaine and marijuana. Let me say that again. More of us will die from cigarettes and alcohol than we will from weed or crack. So why does weed and crack send you to jail, but alcohol and cigarettes don't? You notice that? Because alcohol, first of all, one thing you got to understand about the government again, and when I say government, I'm speaking of all European governments, that's France, Britain, UK. Do you know that illegal drugs and legal drugs are made by the same people? Did you know that? Do you know that illegal drugs is worth $500 billion a year to the United States economy? Without illegal drugs, Wall Street would crash. Why did America go into Afghanistan in 9/11? Was it to make the world safe for democracy? It ain't safe here. Because Afghanistan is the #1 poppy producing country on the face of the earth. If you don't believe me, go and look it up. The Taliban have burned all the poppy seed in Afghanistan. And former Secretary of State Colin Powell went over there and gave them a $50 million grant, which was reported in the New York Times. Why would the Secretary of State for the United States be giving the Afghani people $50 million to replant poppy seed so America gets its supply?
Now, my beauty, something with poison in it, I think. With poison in it, but attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Poppies. Poppies will put them to sleep. Sleep. Now they'll sleep.
They funnel the drug profit through Wall Street so Wall Street can stay afloat, good people. The #1 business of America is drugs. What made America big? Tobacco and hemp. Hemp is nothing but marijuana. Do you know more hemp was grown in America than any other crop during the Revolutionary period? And they talking about they anti-drug. If they was anti-drug, there would have never been no American Revolution. Next slide. In the early 1900s, white employers used to give cocaine to black workers to increase energy and stamina. Next slide. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. The same year that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey started the largest organization in black history, the Universal Negro Improvement Association of African Communities League. Jamaica, he came to America in 1916. UNIA was incorporated in 1916. And he gave us the Negro World, the most powerful, prolific, and well-known black newspaper of all time. Nothing today can touch it. He gave us the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation, the only major leader to put ships on the water for black people. He gave us the Negro Factories Corporation. He gave us 2 colleges. He gave us black men who stood up and defended the black community away from the Ku Klux Klan. And do you know who helped to bring down the Honorable Marcus? And most of all, he gave us the what? Red, black, and green flag, Madison Square Garden, 1920. That flag we did not have before Garvey. And the significance of the flag is this. Prior to the first International Convention for Negro Peoples, black people had no symbol to represent them universally as a race. In fact, there was a very popular song that said, every race has a flag except the coon. Coon is another word for the N-word. And Marcus Garvey said we're going to do something about that. But jealous black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who I respect for the good that he did, A. Philip Randolph, who I respect for the good that he did, and others, conspired with the United States government to get the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey locked up on mail fraud charges, claiming that he falsely advertised stock for his Black Star Line Steamship Corporation in an empty envelope that was believed to have had something in it to incriminate Garvey that they could never find, which was owned by black men who claimed he used to work for Marcus Garvey, that Marcus Garvey never saw a day in his life. And the presiding judge at the Garvey trial was an NAACP member and friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. Garvey gets deported in 1927 and 1930, the Nation of Islam. 1930, you get the rebirth of the Moore Science Center. You get Father Divine, you get Daddy Drake. From Garvey, we get Malcolm X. Malcolm's father was killed because he was chapter president of the UNIA. Malcolm's mother used to write poetry for the Negro world. The Black Hebrews, J. Arnold Ford, who's one of the fathers of the Black Hebrews, wrote the universal African anthem for the Garvey movement. There is no black leader you get, I care not who you name, who did not take a page out of Garveyism. And that's not a slight, because everybody comes from something. Garvey wasn't the first person who said your God better look like you. That was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He wasn't the first one who took a ship to Africa. Paul Cuffey did that. Martin Delaney did that. The Liberian Exodus Joint Stop Steamship Corporation. I'm telling you to study your history. You got to be able to sit in a chair, sit your children down, sit your grandchildren down, and give them the history out of your mouth. We call it the oral tradition. And the reason we can't follow it no more because we stopped studying who we are. And so one of the things I try to prepare black kids for where I go is to know their history, because when they get to college, them white kids know who they are. Them Oriental kids know who they are, and they're going to start talking about history, and we're going to start talking about sneakers.
A lot of people think history is just a study of dates, you say, and reading information of things that happened in the past. That is certainly not the case. History in the human mind is always present. The past is always present. Things that happened to you at 1 year old, 2 year old, when you were 3 years old, are operating in you right at this moment. And the way you react to other people, the kind of taste you have, the desires you have, the kind of love relations you seek, and all of those kind of things are to a great extent determined by your experience before you were 3 or 4 years old. In other words, those experiences between birth and actually even in the womb itself, but between birth, 2 and 3 and 4 years old, operate right now to color your perception, to determine to a good degree the nature of your interaction with other people. In other words, then, the past is not something that's dead and gone and dropped off in your mind. It operates right here, this very moment, this very second, and it will operate until the day you die. And it's the same thing occurs in the history of a race. If you look at the history of a race, the way you look at an individual, those experiences that happened to us 200 and 300 years ago are not dead and gone by a long shot. Many of us are sitting here right now wanting to assimilate with white folk, wanting to be one. Many of us are struggling with feelings of inferiority and all of those kinds of things. Where did you think that started? You think it started here today? And so the experience of ourselves as a group is alive in us. Another indication of the importance of history, of course, is the fact that those who rule over us and those who dominate us have worked very hard at distorting our history and at hiding our history from us and at falsifying our history. So if history were not that important to everyday life, to real life, and to concrete activities, why then has this nation and the people who rule it worked so hard to destroy African history? Why are they resisting the inclusion of African history and African culture in the educational structure if they think that inclusion is purely harmless from their point of view? You can recognize in your everyday behavior, if you've been given the wrong history about a person, how that can change your behavior toward that person. Or if people have a wrong history about you, they've been given the wrong information about you. People interact with other people based on their history of the other person, you see. If people want to change the nature of people's relationships, they will often falsify the history of one or both of those persons, knowing that one or both of those persons are going to interact with each other differently depending on their history or that sense of the history of the individual. This goes on with groups, ladies and gentlemen. That's why those in power then, you see, rewrite history.
Historians from England will say I am a liar, but history is written by those who have hanged heroes.
Those in power then, you see, rewrite history. Because in rewriting history, they rewrite the person's perception of himself, whose history they've rewritten. They also then change that person's behavior and relationships with other people, given the history that they have come to believe. And they also change the way other people interact with those people, you see, based on the history that they've learned about the people, you see. That's why any group has to take command of its history and to make sure that it projects the kind of history that operates in its best interest. It cannot let another people write its history and let another people, you see, determine the nature of its history. And it must also know the history of other people as well, if it is to maintain self-control and self-determination, you see. But history is not a mere remembrance of experience. Everything we've learned in the past. You know, if you've learned to talk, you've learned to walk, and any other thing, you've learned it when? Not today. You learned it years ago. So if you, in a purely theoretical sense, forgot all of your history and all of your experience, you would return then to a fetal state of existence, to a state of immaturity. You would be reduced in your capacity to deal with current and present realities. Many of the coping techniques and things that you've learned in your past would not be useful to you because you would not have them at hand. The same thing is true then in the life of a people. We learned a lot of things as African people. We learned to cope with a lot of things. We learned a lot of methods and techniques for solving problems. The forgetting of African history, the not knowing of African history then, breeds in us a certain levels of immaturity and incapacities to deal with problems which confront us today. So you see, history is not a game of just remembrance. History is an instrument of power. And when you let another people falsify your history, they then will destroy your power